All right, thanks everybody for joining today. Uh, we're pleased to have Michael Smitasin from LBL, and he is going to be doing a talk that I've actually been looking forward to ever since earlier this summer when there was a couple of pretty public incidents with Cloudflare, and Michael reached out and said, hey, we're doing some stuff with this. I can give a little bit of an experience about how we've implemented this at the LBL level. So this is going to be a talk that intersects both networking and security, and hopefully it will help answer some questions I know that I've been having and be useful to others that are looking into implementing similar solutions. So I will turn it over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Jason. So as Jason mentioned, my name is Mike Smitasin. I'm a cybersecurity engineer here at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Just a quick intro. So I've been at LBNL for just about 7 years now. I've been in the cybersecurity group for 2.5 of those years. And prior to that, I was in network engineering in the group that's called LBLNet. I also did SciNet for about 3 years from 2015 to 2017, and I've been doing some form of IT since 2005. Just about this talk real quick, it's not a sales pitch. I don't work for Cloudflare and I don't own any Cloudflare stock. So I'm not out to convince you that Cloudflare is something you really need to do. I'm not going to cover all their services. I'm just going to talk about what we're using. Cloudflare has a lot of different features and we're kind of using a subset of those. I think most people are probably familiar with LBL, but for those who aren't, we're a Department of Energy National Laboratory. But we think of ourselves as being very much like a research university. You know, we're right next door to UC Berkeley, and we have a lot of close relationships with them. There are a lot of researchers here who have joint appointments at UC Berkeley and at LBL. We've been using Cloudflare for about 2 years now, or actually, I guess 2.5. We've got about 550 websites in Cloudflare as of September. That includes about 125 business systems or enterprise sites. So things like HR and finance and our main website. Remaining, we've got about 900 on-prem web servers that we're looking to migrate into Cloudflare, and then about 200 off-prem websites or web servers, either hosted at other universities or in the cloud. Our first production site moved in April of 2018. I think that was some finance or business system sites. And then our main big www.lbl.gov site moved in October of 2018, so it just passed the 2-year mark. For this talk, I'm going to be going through kind of laying down the groundwork of how we got to using Cloudflare and the motivations for using Cloudflare. I'm going to look at our specific use, kind of what the day-to-day operations in Cloudflare looks like, go over a very simple diagram of the architecture, and then get into some things like considerations before implementing things that we thought about as we started to do it, and then kind of discovered as we were going along that, oh, maybe we should have thought about these beforehand. Going to look at some of the known limitations that we're aware of, and then go over our lessons learned, and then tie things up with the overall experience of Cloudflare and working with them. So some motivations that brought us to Cloudflare. So we had some actual attacks that occurred on web servers that resulted in some alarming defacements. And we also had some attacks that made the news that were, in our opinion, not very high value attacks. They were pretty low value, but they were misinterpreted. And you know, I'll show an example in a second here, but this is one of the alarming attacks that came up. So this was a defacement of a web server that, you know, it made its way through DOE kind of as a potentially concerning incident. And then this was the one that made the news. So as you can see highlighted there, it says the particle accelerating cyclotron at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory was able, you know, these white hat security researchers were able to get access to it. That's not actually accurate. So I believe what the case was, there was a LabVIEW instance that was exposed that should not have been. And so it didn't have anything to do with the controls of the cyclotron or operations of the cyclotron, but it was interpreted as being that way. So as a cybersecurity group, you know, we rely on visibility into attacks and traffic. And as things have moved off-prem to the cloud, And as things have started implementing SSL, TLS more, we've started to lose some of that visibility. And so whether those are, VMs at AWS, or if they're a software as a service provider or serverless apps, we don't have the same visibility with those as we do for a server that's running on site, that the traffic is crossing our taps. And so Cloudflare gives us some of that visibility back. It's not quite full packet captures, so if you're thinking of SSL decryption as full packet captures, it's not that. It's much closer to like an Apache SSL log. One of the other motivations was DOE and DHS has this thing called Binding Operational Directive 1801 that has some requirements around securing web servers and email. And so Cloudflare allowed us to meet some of those requirements, and I'll talk a little bit about that more in a second. And then just, we like using new technology, and we didn't have a web application firewall prior to Cloudflare. And so it was an opportunity for us to get hands-on with some of that new tech. We looked at some alternatives. So in just web application firewall space, we looked at F5 and Imperva. We were already F5 customers, and we have some institutional experience with F5. And Imperva is kind of like, or at least at the time, was this industry leading product. We did a shootout between the three of them, and Cloudflare won out in the end. We also have considered things like doing VPN tunnels to VPCs, or just having the web server admins configure log forwarding to our central syslog server. And we might have to use those at some point for different servers, because not everything is going to work in Cloudflare. But we're hoping that Cloudflare will cover the vast majority of cases, and so far that seems to be the case. So this is the very simple architecture of where Cloudflare falls in the workflow of like an HTTP GET request from a client to a server. So normally your client would just go directly to your web server, or your cloud offering, and it would respond and go back to the client. And so all Cloudflare is doing is just sitting in between those, and it does that via DNS resolution. So I don't have it shown here, but I have a different diagram that shows it. So we would go and update our DNS instead of example.lbl.gov pointing to the IP address of this on-prem server or the cloud service. It would point to Cloudflare, and then Cloudflare would proxy that request onto the server. And as it's doing that proxying, it can apply things like the web application firewall. It can do caching. It can do its CDN or load balancing. And then where cybersecurity comes in is we actually pull down these logs from Cloudflare with, I'll show an example, but with details like URI and host and user agent and the request method and response and all that stuff. And then it's just worth noting here, so, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, but you should consider applying some sort of local firewall or router ACLs to protect your server, your what we call the origin server that actually hosts the content, so that clients can't bypass Cloudflare and connect directly to it, basically restricting it just to Cloudflare. So our specific use, as I mentioned, Cloudflare has a lot of different services and features. We are primarily using it as a reverse proxy for HTTP and HTTPS. We still run our own authoritative DNS in-house. In our case, it's Bind, and we still use our own registrars, so primarily Google domains, but I think we still have a little bit of GoDaddy left over. You can technically have Cloudflare be authoritative for your DNS, and I think they do have like a beta program where you can have them be a registrar as well, but we're not doing either one of those. We had existing workflows and processes and approval and change control kind of in place for authoritative DNS, and we didn't want to give that up or make significant changes to that just for Cloudflare. We're using the web application firewall as well as some IP-based restrictions. So for example, we have some sites that we only want accessible from on-prem or connected to our VPN. And so we can restrict those to our IP address space using Cloudflare's firewall, which is, they kind of differentiate between their firewall rules and their web application firewall. I had mentioned the Binding Operational Directive 1801 stuff, and some TLS certs. So basically, because we are proxying the web server to the client, we can terminate their SSL connection at Cloudflare, which lets us set things like strong ciphers and TLS version, things that the actual web server, the origin server, may not be able to do for some reason. Like say it's a very old appliance from a scientific company that they're trying to offer a web server, and providing a web server is not the primary thing that it does. So we can meet the requirements of the BOD without necessarily making those changes on the origin server because of the proxying through Cloudflare. These were kind of a secondary thing. We're using the cache and the CDN and load balancers. You kind of just get those as a product of having Cloudflare, at least the cache and CDN. Not a whole lot of usage for load balancers here. We have a few people that are using load balancers, but for the most part, it's just the cache and CDN. And then, as I mentioned, cybersecurity is using the logging functionality that Cloudflare offers. It's a product called logpull. They used to call it enterprise log share. And basically, we query their API and pull down JSON formatted logs. And we do that both for the access logs as well as the audit logs for actual changes that are being made in Cloudflare. And then in the future, there are a couple of products that we're thinking about taking on. So they have something called Access, which is like a pseudo web VPN. You go and authenticate to a page, and it gets you access to sites that maybe can't do single sign-on or can't do integration with your other authentication methods. And so you kind of handle the authentication through Cloudflare first. And they also have a non-HTTP proxy product called Spectrum that we've looked at a little bit, but have concerns about vendor lock-in. We don't want to get too tied to Cloudflare for those particular services. And then this is just a real quick snapshot of some of our stats. So on the left is the 30-day traffic stats as of like October 8th. So, about 500,000 visitors, 50 million requests, about 50% of those are served from the cache. And then a 72-hour snapshot of the web application firewall events. So about 40,000 total events. 25,000 of those are what are called log/simulate actions. Basically, that is a pass-through. So we have various WAF rules that we have decided are too sensitive and cause too many false positives, and so we set those to log/simulate. And then we've got about 7,000 blocks and 3,000 challenges. Those are CAPTCHA challenges where it would prompt the user to interact. So then this is an example of the JSON formatted logs that we're pulling out of their API. So, it gives you pretty much the same stuff that you would expect to see in an Apache SSL log: client IP address, the host, the request method, the URI, user agent, somewhere in here. User agent. But then it also has some extra stuff here. So if there's a WAF action, in this case, it's a drop, and then it tells you the rule ID and the rule message. And so if this was actually allowed through, you would see other stuff like the response bytes and the response status. And then just kind of a neat thing is that I'm sure a lot of people have seen Cloudflare error messages on other sites before. They actually do allow you to customize those error messages. And so we've taken advantage of that, and we have kind of a branded custom error page that we have made using the style guidelines from our creative services office. So day-to-day operations, Phil Butler, I think, is on the call, is primarily responsible for these day-to-day operations. They largely consist of two different things. So adding something to Cloudflare and then troubleshooting the WAF. Adding something to Cloudflare can be very easy. As simple as just logging into the Cloudflare GUI and going and creating a record, and then going and updating DNS to point to that record. In our case, we also have border ACLs on our border firewalls to restrict inbound traffic for HTTP and HTTPS to improve set of web servers. And so for us, we also have to go and add the IP address if it's on-prem to that prefix list, but that may not be the case for everyone. And then this is just a quick look at what that looks like in the Cloudflare GUI. So it's really just as easy as clicking the DNS tab, clicking add record. It defaults to an A record, put in your host name, your IP address, and click save. And once you do that, you've got that what we call the cdn.cloudflare.net record. So it's basically just, it takes your host name and prepends it to that record or to that domain. And then you would go and create the CNAME pointing your actual record to that cloudflare.net record. And then as I mentioned, tuning the WAF is something that we have to do somewhat regularly as well, just because of false positives. And what that usually looks like is going and checking the logs for the particular event that occurred. The error message will give you something that's called array ID, and that's a unique identifier that Cloudflare uses. If you don't have that, you might also be able to just go and look based on timestamp and IP address of the client. And so looking through the logs, you're trying to get the rule ID that identifies the rule that was triggered on that event. And once you have that, then you can decide, do we want to disable this rule? Do we want to disable the WAF entirely for this site or for this particular URI? Or do we ask the sysadmin to make changes to their underlying software so that it doesn't trigger this false positive? This is just a quick look at the GUI for changing a rule. So you would click on the firewall tab, click on manage rules. They have a bunch of rule sets. In this example, let's just say it's a Cloudflare Drupal rule set. And then this is the rule ID that is pulled out of the logs. And so you'd find the rule ID and then go and change the action that happens with that. It defaults to block in this case. You can change it to log/simulate, which passes through, or you can change it to CAPTCHA. So it prompts the user for a CAPTCHA. So Cloudflare, when you initially look at it, at least using it as a reverse proxy, seems very simple and very easy to use. But there are some things that you may want to consider before pulling the trigger and implementing it. So just some things that we thought of either beforehand or as we were starting to implement. So do you want to move your authoritative DNS into Cloudflare? There are some benefits of doing it, and there are some downsides of doing it. Do you require that you preserve some sort of local record for DNS, for example, for your static IP addresses? So LBL requires that all of our static IP addresses have DNS records mapped to them, in part because we also have contact information tied to those DNS records. And so in order to do that and update the real record, so example.lbl.gov, to point that at Cloudflare, we have to then append something onto the record in order to have a local record. So in this case, if example.lbl.gov is the real record that points to Cloudflare, we would have an example-local or example-management.lbl.gov that would point to the IP address of the on-prem server. It's probably also worth discussing, how do you want to handle false positives or unintended blocks? Are you willing to go and disable the WAF entirely for a site, or disable rules, or disable it for a URI? Or do you say, well, if a site can't use our WAF rules, are we just going to take it out of Cloudflare altogether? And going along with that, do you want to allow individual configurations, Snowflake configurations for every single site, or do you want to just have a monolithic configuration for all your sites? And how do you handle config management? How do you handle backups and change control? Because Cloudflare doesn't have a mechanism for approving changes right now. Do you want to make those changes in the Cloudflare GUI and then pull down a backup via their API? Or do you want to make the changes locally in JSON format and then push those up to to Cloudflare via their API? Kind of organizationally, do you want to have a centralized management of Cloudflare where just your IT division, a group within your IT division is responsible for all changes to Cloudflare? Or do you want to assign kind of delegated control out to different administrators throughout your organization and let them, control their own sites? And if you don't do that, what kind of visibility do you need to give to your system admins so that they can see, what server does this URL actually resolve to? And, what are problems that are occurring with it? How's the performance of it? How much caching are we doing for it? And then somewhat obviously, what do we put in Cloudflare and what do we not put in Cloudflare? A WordPress or a Drupal site, maybe that is very obvious to go into Cloudflare, but what about something like Persona or Globus endpoints, things that use HTTP and HTTPS, but would not make sense as something to be proxy through Cloudflare. Um, so, over the last 2 years, as we've started putting things in Cloudflare, we've kind of discovered these known limitations. And so I alluded to it earlier. It is possible, if you don't configure a ACL or firewall rule in front of your on-prem server or even your off-prem server, it is possible for an attacker to go and connect directly to your server and perform attacks there without them ever going through Cloudflare. So they're bypassing the WAF, they're bypassing the logging on it. So fortunately, Cloudflare does publish the IP addresses that they use. So you can dynamically fetch those IP addresses and update your router ACLs or your firewall rules or your local firewall on your host itself. That I'm not sure if I mentioned it in the lessons learned, but what we have found is that cloud providers and SaaS providers don't necessarily allow you to do this. We've had some fairly major services that they just didn't provide us a way to lock down incoming connections to IP addresses. And so that's just something you have to be aware of and determine how you're going to mitigate for. I mentioned that, we're primarily using Cloudflare for our HTTP and HTTPS proxying. That is really their bread and butter. That's the majority of what they do. And so, even though they have Spectrum, which is their non-HTTP proxy, it doesn't have the same kind of parity. They're not putting the same kind of development into it. The web application firewall, none of that exists for non-HTTP, right? So just something to be aware of, that they're really a web company. If you have a intrusion detection system or intrusion prevention system at that, you may want to Cloudflare IP addresses, or you might want to whitelist Cloudflare IP addresses because, for example, once you start proxying a bunch of sites through Cloudflare, the connections that you see coming into your site or into your campus are going to be from Cloudflare IP addresses. And so you don't want your IDS, your IPS to interpret that as an attack and then block that IP address. So fortunately, again, Cloudflare does publish those IP addresses, so you can just dynamically fetch them and add them to your whitelists. So Cloudflare does have a rate limiting feature, but you have to enable it, and I think you have to pay for it. I think it's extra. And the reason why that's relevant is that if Cloudflare isn't intercepting an attack or a large amount of traffic, it doesn't determine that it's an attack. It'll just proxy that all onto your server. And so their cache and their CDN will only do so much. If it's not caching those requests or those response to those requests, those are just going to get sent on to your origin server. And so it is still possible to get overwhelmed. And the example that I can give someone in recent memory is that we had a web server that would create a session file for every single request that would come along. And it got hit by a web application scanner. And for every single connection, I think it was even just crawling, but every single connection attempt that scanner did created a session file until the origin server just filled up its disk. And Cloudflare didn't interpret any of those as attacks, and so it wasn't preventing any of those from going through. Probably the biggest limitation that we've ran into, and it has been kind of the biggest pain point for us, is just the structure that Cloudflare requires you to work within. And what I mean by that is Cloudflare has these concepts of like accounts, zones, and sites. And so here in this diagram, we've got accounts, which are the pink boxes. You can assign administrators on an account level. And then within that account, there are zones, and within the zones are sites. And the zones have kind of a tie to DNS conceptually. So for example, we've got the lbl.gov zone, the general lbl.gov zone, and then all the sites within that lbl.gov zone are basically subdomains or records within lbl.gov. But where that can be tricky is that if we want to give control to a set of admins to only a few sites in lbl.gov, we can't just do that by adding them to this prod account, because that would give them access to every single site, every single zone within that account. And so what we have to do is we have to spin out a separate account. Let's take this business systems account, for example. and then create individual zones within that account, because we can't have duplicates. We can't have a general lbl.gov zone in both accounts. So we have to create these like specific specific zones for every single site. So, let's say they have 65 different sites. They have to have 65 different zones, each with one site per zone. And because a lot of your zone settings are zone wide, that means that if you have configuration that you're applying, you have to apply it 65 times. Now that does also mean that, these hundreds of sites that are in the general lbl.gov zone, we can make one change there and it affects all those sites. But for these sites that are outside of it, that are in their individual zones, that config has to be replicated to them. Now you can use the API to do that. Or technically, I think Cloudflare has a product that is either available now or will be available in the future that does some sort of configuration management. But if you're not using that, or if your admins aren't at the point where they can do some sort of automation with API, it is a manual replication process. And then you also have to worry about, was something missed, and is that configuration actually consistent across all of your zones? Yeah, so it's just something to be aware of. If you do end up using the API, it's worth noting that there are limitations. So you can, for example, if you're doing log pulling from the API, you can only fetch up to 1 hour of logs at a time. So, you could do this last hour, the hour prior to that, the hour prior to that. So you have to like run your job on a regular schedule. You can't just say, give me all the logs that you have. Also, you have to do a fetch per zone. So I mentioned these zones. So you've got 65 zones here, right? So you have to iterate over each one of those zones to pull the logs for those zones. Um, there's a rate limit, of course, on the API calls. It's changed. I don't remember what the current one is. There was a period where we were hitting the API rate limit on a regular basis, so we had to introduce some pacing to it. And you also could potentially hit the size limit on the response. I think it's fairly large. I think it's like a gig or something like that. But if you have thousands of sites getting a lot of attention, so thousands of visitors per site, I don't know, potentially you could hit that limit. And so then you might have to tune down the frequency that you, or I guess turn up the frequency that you fetch logs. On the topic of APIs, so some of their endpoints require pagination. Annoyingly, it's not consistent, so some do and some don't. But for example, if you need to iterate over all your zone IDs, you first have to get those zone IDs. And there's an API endpoint to get those zone IDs, but you can only get 50 zone IDs per page. And so you have to keep track of your page and go, loop through it 6 times to get all, let's say, 294 zone IDs that you have. But you have to incorporate that into your script, because you can't just have a single script that does both. And then just from a cybersecurity perspective, I mentioned that we like having visibility. If there's an incident involving a Cloudflare admin, and we want to go and look, did an attacker log into Cloudflare with their account? We can't actually see that from our own account, because Cloudflare limits you to not being able to see the login IP or timestamp for other accounts for privacy reasons. So you can still see, did they make any changes, but you can't see, did they just log in and like snoop around. So lessons learned along the way. Some of these are not strictly Cloudflare specific, but there are things that came up in our process of moving sites to Cloudflare. So you may have to do some gymnastics to accommodate servers that are hosting more than just websites. And so, you've got a server that's running FTP and email and LDAP and SSH, and it's being managed by IPMI or whatever. All of those are non-HTTP traffic. If you go and just update your host name to point to Cloudflare, all of those protocols, if they're using host names, will then start going to Cloudflare, which will then drop the traffic. And so then it's question, do you spin off separate host names for those different services? If you've got example.lbl.gov as your website, do you then make ftp.example.lbl.gov for FTP and email.lbl.gov or email.example.lbl.gov for email? Are the system owners, are they willing to do that? Or do you just use the IP address? Or is this one of those cases where you just decide not to put it behind Cloudflare altogether? So I did mention that we're using TLS certs for Cloudflare, or having Cloudflare provide TLS certs to our clients. The potential downside to that is when you create a new zone, it could take up to 30 minutes for that TLS cert to be active. There is a workaround, however, you can use the API to pre-provision it. If, for example, if you're migrating a site into Cloudflare and you want like minimal downtime, but that is another hoop you have to jump through. So just be aware, if you can't take that potentially 30-minute downtime, you might have to use the API to pre-provision the cert. This is one of those cases where it's not really unique to Cloudflare, but it did come up. So beware of CNAME chaining. And that means, if we have a record that's example 0 pointing to an IP address, and then you have a CNAME for example 1 to example 0, and then you have another CNAME, example 2 pointing to example 1. When example 0 moves to Cloudflare, it'll break example 1 and example 2. And so what you just have to do is go and create those records in Cloudflare as well, so that when Cloudflare receives a request for that host name, it knows what to do with it. If you do end up doing logging with Cloudflare, be aware that new zones don't have log retention enabled by default. And so there is an API call that you can make to go and enable log retention. But it's not something that you can do in the UI. And like I said, it's not enabled by default. So fortunately, you can at least do it yourself now. It used to be the case where you had to open a ticket with Cloudflare for every new zone to have them enable it. And that was a huge pain. And then this is not something that I've ran into personally, but Mark, who does some of our business system Cloudflare stuff, they're using load balancing, and they noticed that when they enabled load balancing with the default config, they received a large number of requests from all the different Cloudflare servers that were probing for liveness. And so I think back in March of 2019, they saw 2 requests from 164 different IP addresses every 60 seconds. So for a robust web server, that's probably not a problem. But if you have a very, weak or old web server, if you're running off a Raspberry Pi, that could potentially be something you should be concerned about. Something that again is not super unique to Cloudflare, but something that we ran into, as I mentioned, if you're not running or if you're not using Cloudflare as your authoritative DNS, if you're running your own authoritative DNS, then what you'll be doing is creating CNAMEs for your records to point to Cloudflare. Where that becomes an issue is that CNAMEs can't coexist with other record types. So if your site is the apex record of a domain, or it has MX or TXT records, those can't coexist with CNAMEs. So there is a workaround, but it's unofficial. And if you go and ask Cloudflare about this, they'll tell you, no, don't do this because the addresses could change. But basically it is going and creating the record in Cloudflare and then resolving that record that you would otherwise CNAME to its IP addresses. And so you'll get 2 A records and 2 quad A records, and then you can go and create those in your authoritative DNS. Now, like I mentioned, those could change, and Cloudflare won't tell you if they're going to change or when they're going to change. However, we went and pulled DNS logs for the last 2 years, and we haven't seen any of our records change. They've been stable the entire time. But it is a risk, and Cloudflare doesn't make any provisions to inform you if they change. So you'll want to monitor it. We use a script that just checks for the records every 5 minutes, comparing what we have in our authoritative DNS to what Cloudflare has in their authoritative DNS. So this is somewhat humorous, but if you're doing a mass migration of sites, like hundreds of sites to Cloudflare, it's worth checking that the sites actually work before you move them to Cloudflare, just to save yourself some headaches. Because I think we had something like 200 or so sites that we were migrating at like 3 batches, and we didn't go and check that all the sites worked. And then after the fact, we got questions from some of the site owners saying, hey, my site doesn't work. And then when we went and looked at the logs prior to Cloudflare, it turns out that the site had been broken for like 6 months beforehand. And so, just save yourself some time and make sure the site actually works before you try to add Cloudflare to it. So during the day-to-day operations thing, I pointed out that we have to go and tune the WAF, make changes to the WAF as a result of false positives. We have noticed that some of the rules are pretty aggressive, in particular the OWASP rules. So yeah, so they have this, if you're looking at the log, they have a rule ID that is generic for the OWASP rule set. It's this 981176. And so you may see that very frequently in your logs. Basically, the way that works is that there is a threshold that all the OWASP rules contribute to. And so if it's a SQL injection and a cross-site scripting attack, uh, you know, those will add values to this rule. And once that threshold is exceeded, then a block will occur. But in order to actually get information about what that attack was doing, you have to drill down a little bit. And so this is what it looks like in the firewall tab under activity log. You can go and get information about different events, firewall events. And so in this case, we're looking at an OWASP rule, and it tells you that it was an inbound anomaly score exceeded and the total score here that caused it to be dropped. But to actually get useful information out of it, you have to go and expand this additional logs, and then it tells you all the individual OWASP rules that actually contributed to that threshold being crossed. So something that I think Phil has ran into several times. I had mentioned the structure of Cloudflare and how you might have to have different zones, like a general zone and then more specific zones. When you move a site from one zone to another, that's not something that you can do yourself. You actually have to open a Cloudflare support ticket and have them do it for you, and it can potentially take up to 2 days. So just be aware of that. And then if you do have some DNS records that are they're hosting email, and you have MX records or you have mail routing rules for delivery of mail, you might have to update those before moving them into Cloudflare, because once they move to Cloudflare, that DNS record is going to resolve to Cloudflare IP addresses. Cloudflare is not going to handle your email. They're just going to drop those SMTP connections. And so either you might want to create a second record just for mail, or update your records to point to IP addresses specifically. So I had mentioned one of the things we're doing is the binding operational directive compliancy for BOD 1801. One of those requirements is HSTS, which basically enforces the use of HTTPS for clients. And there's a max age value in there set by the HSTS header of 1 year. And so it says any client that visits the site, it's going to only use HTTPS afterwards for up to 1 year. Where that can be a problem is that if you create a new zone and enable HSTS, and then you migrate a website into Cloudflare, into that zone, all of a sudden HSTS is enabled for it, and it's requiring HTTPS from that point forward for any clients that have visited it up to 1 year. And so if you have a problem and you need to move that site back out of Cloudflare, if that site then can't do HTTPS for some reason, it could just break, right? Like you'll have clients trying to connect with HTTP only, and it'll fail because their HSTS setting says that it must be HTTPS. So my recommendation would be to either make sure that the site can actually do HTTPS before migrating into Cloudflare, or temporarily disabling HSTS on that zone, migrate the site into it, make sure everything's working, you're not going to have to back out of Cloudflare, and then go and enable HSTS after the fact. So if your sites do access control based on IP addresses, specifically client IP addresses, once you move that site to Cloudflare, the packets that it receives are going to have the IP address of the Cloudflare nodes. They're not going to have the client IP addresses in the source address, right? However, Cloudflare does include the client IP address in the HTTP headers. So you can actually go and pull the client IP address out of those headers and then take action on them. And there are things like Apache modules that you can use to do that. Cloudflare has a knowledge base article on how to do it. And then the last one is, this isn't really a technical lessons learned, but Cloudflare is adding complexity to your workflow. So instead of your client going directly to your server, it's going to connect to Cloudflare, and then it's going to connect, and then Cloudflare is going to proxy that to the server. And so you might have people who are hesitant to introduce that complexity to their system, and within reason, because if they aren't Cloudflare admins, it's basically a black box to them, and so you're inserting a black box into their process, and they have legitimate reason to be concerned about that. Jason had mentioned there have been a couple of recent outages with Cloudflare, kind of in the last few years, that have been worldwide impacting. So they're not super frequent, but given the scale of Cloudflare's customer base, they do make the news, and it is something that a lot of people are aware of. So you might have to make some sort of decision about, do we just take the low-hanging fruit first and migrate sites into Cloudflare that are willing to and are easy to do, and then come back, circle around to the more difficult sites and the people who have concerns, and try to mitigate those concerns. And that's kind of where LBL is right now. We're kind of going back through the more difficult stuff right now. And so then this is the last slide. Our overall experience, I just wanted to try to summarize the experience of the people who work with Cloudflare at LBL. So in terms of ease of use, it is at times shockingly easy. You go and click like 5 buttons in Cloudflare's GUI, and then you've got a site using Cloudflare. But the downside to that is it is also very opaque at times. Even as a Cloudflare admin, you can't always see exactly what Cloudflare is doing. You can't see the exact regular expressions that are being matched in the web application firewall. Some of the tuning or some of the caching parameters may not be very obvious. There are some things that you can only see via the API, and you can't see it in the UI. And so, it is kind of a double-edged sword there. Performance, we've had very good performance with Cloudflare. I think technically the WAF introduces something like 100 or so microseconds of delay. That hasn't really been an issue for us. The only place that we've really noticed performance weirdness is with caching. We migrated our map site to it, which is basically a campus map that lets you see the different buildings around campus and get information for them, but it uses image tiles. And that was one place where it was very clear that the image tiles were loading slower in Cloudflare than outside of Cloudflare. And so Phil went and made some caching tuning adjustments there and resolved that. Reliability, so I mentioned the 2 major worldwide outages. So I think it's only been 2 over the course of like 2 or 3 years, but they were big, and they affected like all of Cloudflare's customers. That said, I think Cloudflare does a remarkable job of writing up their postmortems. They have a crazy amount of technical detail telling you like exactly what went wrong, how it happened, how it got past their existing controls, and then all the changes that they're planning to make to basically prevent this class of problem from happening again. And so I think it really goes a long ways to kind of build confidence in their service and that they know what they're doing. And along with that, so their customer service team, so having to open up a ticket with Cloudflare, whether it's because we have a question or there is something that's not behaving as we expected, Cloudflare is like super responsive. They typically get us some sort of answer within 24 hours. And the answers so far have all been very detailed and technical. There have been cases where we haven't necessarily gotten an answer that we wanted. For example, we had a question about a DNS resolution error that occurred recently, and their response was basically, well, unfortunately, we only take sampled logs of our DNS, and so we can't say this single failure that occurred exactly, what the source IP address and the destination IP address of the query was. But that is at least a reasonable and explained answer, which I think is unique compared to at least some other vendors that I've had to open tickets with. And then finally, our account team. So I don't know, we meet with them every 3 months, 3 to 6 months or so, to just discuss new services that Cloudflare is offering and kind of talk over with them our pain points. I think they do what they can, but we recognize that we are not Cloudflare's largest customer. We're not spending millions of dollars with them. And so they may not necessarily be able to make a change to the entire Cloudflare platform just based on our singular feedback. That said, if there is something that is causing us a lot of problems, they will try to find some other way for us to, work around it. And that's something that I think we really appreciate. So I think that's about all I have. I don't think I've seen any questions yet. If anybody has questions or if we run out of time, feel free to drop me an email or our Cloudflare team. It's just cloudflare@lbl.gov. If anybody's interested in the script that we use to pull down logs from their API, I posted it to GitHub. It's not particularly sophisticated or elegant, but it works. And feel free to make pull requests or suggestions on it if there's something that I'm doing stupid there that you think I should do differently.
All right. Well,
looks
thank
like
you
we do
so
have
much,
a question.
Michael. Yeah, we had one come in, so I'll just repeat it. Zane wants to know, can you give us an idea of pricing? And I don't know if you're under any NDA, but if you do have an idea.
I don't know if LBL has an NDA regarding pricing with Cloudflare. From what I recall, they charge us for a quantity of sites. And so I say that as like, we said, we've got 900 sites that we want to put within Cloudflare. And they said, okay, this is the price that we're going to charge for you that every year. And I think it's on the order of like less than $100,000 per year.
Okay. And Jason Lee would like to know, is there a limit to the number of subdomains, a.gov, b.gov, c.gov, etc.? You mentioned this was a scaling issue to manage.
I don't recall if Cloudflare will limit the number of domains that you can put in. We certainly have non-lbl.gov domains in Cloudflare. I want to say we have on the order of 20 or so. But they're .org, they're .net, .com. I think so I mentioned, we purchased a certain number of sites, 900 sites or something like that. That has to be basically spread across your accounts. And so you have to allocate those sites to each one. So if you have, 5 different 5 different accounts with, 3 sites per account or something like that, you'll have to allocate those total number of sites to each one of those accounts. And so that could be some sort of limitation.
Okay. Corey points out one approach that he's used for the Apex record limitation is to host a redirect from the Apex record to a canonical server name in AWS with an elastic IP. I don't know if that's something you guys tried or not.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we do something similar to that in some situations. So not using AWS Elastic IP, but using Google's Google App Engine. Our collaboration services group runs a redirect service with that. And so that was one option. We thought about having, your Apex record would point to Google App Engine, which would then do a redirect to the www record. I think we've kind of decided to go away from that because it's adding kind of 2 layers of complexity, maybe as instead of just one by doing the A and quad A records, but it's an option as well.
Okay. And Hervey wants to know, you mentioned latency increase, but have you seen or had reports of better latency for any international customers?
Truth be told, I can't say that we have received any reports of better latency, but it's not, I don't know if I would necessarily hear about that. I think it would be the individual site owners who would be reporting that. And so far, I've not heard of that.
Okay. Eli is pointing out, thinking strategically, is Cloudflare likely to be a permanent change in the way people manage their web presence? For example, Akamai ushered in the era of broadly caching static content, and we've not changed back and are unlikely to do so. Is there that level of change that has the potential to occur here?
I mean, I think, Cloudflare does have a CDN, so they're offering something very similar to what Akamai is doing. I'm guessing if they do anything that is world changing, it will probably be in one of their other product offerings. So in particular, I'm thinking about their Cloudflare Access or their Spectrum non-HTTP proxy. Both of those are pretty new products, and so we've only played around with them a little bit. So it kind of to be determined whether those have enough legs that they're going to like change the world for people.
Okay. And we've got another from Soleil. Can you give an advice or any lessons learned on how to act upon Cloudflare malicious traffic that makes it through the ACL rules and the IDS whitelisting?
Yeah. So we have had, I think, 2 occurrences of that in the last 2 years. Yeah. So the kind of approach that you have when you're not using Cloudflare, right, would be to go and block the client IP address by your IDS. Clearly can't do that with Cloudflare because you'll be blocking a Cloudflare IP address, and then affecting all your sites, right? So you don't want to do that. I think the way that you would have to approach it is blocking it in Cloudflare, which you could do either manually by logging into the web interface and adding a block of the IP address, because you can just do that. There's a list of IP addresses that you can say allow or disallow or CAPTCHA, and you could integrate that with their API. So you could have Bro or Zeek, instead of taking an action to block it at your border router, you could have it trigger an API call up to Cloudflare and block it at Cloudflare. I think that's probably the best way to go about it if you needed to do something like that is making its way through the WAF and your IDS as it is.
And I had a similar sort of musing, and since we're out of questions right now, I'll throw mine in here. Has this complicated any sort of processes that you were used to doing a certain way to the extent where the cost benefit is that it's just much harder to do something easy now, or is it universally just sort of better with this system in place?
So I think there are kind of 2 perspectives on that. There's the cybersecurity perspective, which has introduced a new place that we have to go and look for logs at. It's not generating Bro or Zeek logs that are just integrated with our existing processes. And then the other place is not cybersecurity, but it's just in terms of managing the web presence. So now we have this other thing that we have to go and make changes to, and keep track of those changes and those configurations. And it's another step in the process. I think ultimately, I will admit that there were times in the migration where I had many headaches and, wish there was some other way to do what we were trying to do. But ultimately, I had to admit that Cloudflare was what we had, and there wasn't a better way to do it without investing significantly more effort than what we had already done. And so, and that includes like reverting out of doing Cloudflare. That was not going to be a tenable option. So I think, yeah, it definitely, there is an increase in resources, but hopefully you're getting more benefit out of it than your cost.
Okay. Well, we have a pause here, so I will thank you for a really great talk. I think that this really does highlight how this could be used at a big lab institution like LBL, but for others that may be representing campuses and regionals and have to host a bunch of web things. If anybody does have any additional questions, please type them in now. Otherwise, we'll make sure that we get these slides posted and the video posted. And you can certainly reach out to Michael and the Cloudflare team using those email addresses as well.
Yep, please do. We are more than happy to help. Give our impressions or advice if you're struggling with something with Cloudflare.
All right, looks like we may be out. So thanks everybody for attending today. There will not be a talk next week because of Halloween, but we will pick up again the week after, which I think is November 6th. That sounds right. And it's going to be our postponed talk on Persona and Ansible. So we will send out some notes and we will talk to everybody soon.
Thank you.